know, we talk about this a lot in the support group because George often attends, and I think there's a lot of people that don't know anything about it. And I guess the question is, how relevant is this?
Well, I mean, this is my perspective, is I think there is relevance. Certainly, my 30,000-foot view of ApoE4 is that it's inflammatory, which is good in an acute sense and poor in a chronic sense. And it also is well adapted to deprivation, which is a maladaptation to modern society. So that's kind of that's the lens that I look at this thing from.
And then you've got the mitochondrial deficit, which is real, which is proven. The deficit in glucose-dependent ATP generation in 4s, which is dose-dependent. So with 2-4 alleles, there's a definite deficit in mitochondrial ATP generation from glucose.
But it's a great question because for a 3-4 male, it might not be that big a deal.
And it's less now with the years as it's getting on. We're finding that it's less. Because I was 4 or 5 years ago, I was terrified for my sons who are 3-4s, but now I'm like, man, it's not that much increased risk. So for a male 3-4, Alzheimer's-wise, doesn't appear to be, in the absence of insulin resistance, does not appear to be a huge problem. Or a cardiovascular disease for a 3-4 male. But if I had a 4-4 daughter, I would not be happy.
Or a 3-4 daughter, which actually begs really another question of gender. You know, why are we at greater risk?
The estrogen.
Because of our gender
It's gotta
and
be the
hormones.
estrogen.
And, yes, I mean.
Has to be.
Yeah. Well, I think that is part of it, but you know, we also know that the brain carries certain proclivities gender-wise that in women, as a psychiatrist, actually, if we use certain medications, second-generation antipsychotics, for instance, women are actually more prone to a condition called tardive dyskinesia, which is a movement disorder. Why is that? You know, so there's something more going on than just hormones. So you know, something's gender-wise specific that I think we're really at the fetal stage, not the infancy. We're really at a fetal stage for understanding.
I didn't know that about women in tardive dyskinesia. They're more prone to it.
And more oxidative stress, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're really, you know, I mean, look around the room here, too. It's like, there's a preponderance of us here, like, wanting some answers.
Right. Well, Andrea, so we met at AHS in Boulder, and then we had dinner together in Auckland. So we go back a ways, thanks to George introducing us. But we talked. I forgot what my point was. I'm sorry.
we had a bit of a discussion about saturated fat, which is segueing to a different thing. We had a different, because we as a group are not quite sure what the effect of saturated fat has on homozygotes.
Yeah.
And
so,
that's a very grey area, very, very grey.
Right. I remember what I was going to talk about. It was calcium scores.
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
That's where but it relates to the saturated fat. And so Ivor and I were preparing for this last night and trying to figure out where the conversation would go. But at AHS, we had a discussion with a lot of the ApoE4.4s, and just randomly people were coming up and saying, well, I have a high calcium score. And it would be awesome that if we had some evidence-based research looking, people.
Most of us have done it. I'm 0, thank God, but we've got other members who have got high scores.
So,
yeah, but he's a 3.
So the question is, how does that relate if you look at the general population? In other words, is there a correlation between your ApoE status and the high calcium score?
You know, and as a Gundry patient, what he has told us, what he has observed, is that in 4s, whether 3-4s or 4-4s, is that he's observed higher SD-LDL-C and oxidized LDL in 4s who consume a lot of saturated fat. Well, and also coconut oil.
I think, yeah, but Gundry, correct me if I'm wrong, and I've watched a couple of his lectures, and my own sponsor is very much a Gundry man. He's an E3, E4, he had very advanced disease. But I think Gundry speaks a lot to surrogate markers and LDLP and ApoB, but
Well, no, he mostly looks at, as a patient, I can tell you, he looks at SDLDLC.
and SDLDL and all these things that are
That's the
surrogates.
only-
Well, but he doesn't actually,
Electrolytes.
like an LDLP, doesn't care.
Doesn't care.
Oh, he doesn't.
No.
No,
No.
no, he doesn't care.
No.
He doesn't care. He'll look at,
He doesn't discuss.
he'll look at a triglyceride to HDL ratio.
Size.
He'll look at
Yeah.
triglyceride to HDL, and he'll look at, oxidized LDL, and he'll look at SDLDL. And
that's
beyond that, he doesn't really care. He has other inflammatory markers that are cardiac and
Sure,
otherwise
that's right,
registered,
yeah.
and he looks at those.
So he's looking at inflammation
Yes.
and insulin
Yes.
sensitivity.
And-
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
No, I was
Yes.
under the impression actually, and certainly a lot of people we know, that high particle count Gundry sees sensitivity to high particle count with these animal products possibly, and that's one of his measures of risk and problem. But you're saying SDLDL is more his thing.
No, I mean, I would say that
Inflammatory.
I mean, Teresa, I think the first time we had a test, she had a 2400 LDLP, and he could
He didn't care.
He could care
Oh,
less.
well, that's good, because
Yeah.
that means we're much more aligned just from that statement alone.
No, he could care less, and he could care less about that.
Wow,
And
that's-
I mean, in
that's
fact,
super
what he has
clear.
told us, because, and he says there's an East Coast in the U.S., an East Coast West Coast divide in terms of looking at like LDL markers and all that stuff.
Yeah, size and-
And he is on the West Coast side, and he says we have, doctor or cardiologist chat rooms, lipidologist chat rooms where we quote yell at each other over, and he says that his perspective is that these tests are designed to convince people to take statins.
Right,
Right.
and I can
So,
certainly understand that
Ronald
perspective.
Krauss is West Coast.
Yes.
Kraus
Yeah.
is
East Coast is
West Coast, yeah.
Well,
Oh, right.
yeah, so Krauss is a small dense guy. I
Yeah.
know that sounds terrible.
You're a large fluffy guy. Have you seen it?
I have, yeah. It's just the way it came out. Dayspring.
There's another large fluffy guy.
He's a small non-dense guy.
Yeah,
and he's more
no,
volume than mass. Sorry. So just to get back on the point, so William Davis, cardiologist, tends towards the small dense, not so much
Right.
number. I didn't realize actually Gundry is the same. And Krauss, to an extent, is there as well. And then Dayspring, Peter Attia, quite popular, is a big number
Is a
guy.
Dayspring.
Yeah.
And would attack the idea of small dense being independent. And
Right.
would be the lesser thing. So that's interesting.
And
So
so
you got-
Gundry published really a poster at a
Conference.
at a conference a couple of years ago, and I'm making this up, but it was like 1,000 patients who had
800.
frank. Pardon me?
800.
No, not that statement.
Oh,
not
another
that
one.
and it was, and these people had, diagnosed cardiovascular risk factors and all that stuff. And he said, okay, following his protocol, and I've forgotten over 12 years, but there was a varying range of how people followed. And I've shared with Jeff a copy of our tests, and you can see what he tests for. And he tests a wide variety of things, and then he says, okay, get your numbers in line. And without prescribing statins, his risk was like, I think 1.6 or 1.8% of people over that time had to have a stent, had to have a bypass, had to have, had a heart attack or something like that. And he said that somebody on the standard low-fat statin approach, you're looking at 30-40% of people in a 5-year period are going to have an issue.
But if you take that, say 30% to 2%, a 15x,
Right.
benefit with his protocol.
Right.
How much of that benefit is low carb and all the other things, and how much is avoiding the cheese and the animal products? I'd love to know.
No, and I don't know that he knows, because it's individualized.
True.
I mean, because he's like saying, because they aren't. He says 30% of his patients are 4s.
3 4s. Or
Three
4s.
3 4s or 4
Okay.
4s.
Have a 4.
30% of his patients are
Yeah.
4s of either kind.
So you've seen a lot of that.
All right,
That's good.
and the study didn't differentiate and say, okay, and he's not like, because he takes as a patient, he looks at you and says, okay, for your markers, do this, this, and this, and for these people, do whatever.
So he's primarily looking quite rightly at the markers, and that's great that he's not looking at LDLP, that's super. So he's primarily looking at the markers. He's treating 2 markers, but they're good markers of inflammatory
And a whole
issues.
plethora of them.
A whole plethora, exactly. He's not just a day spring. And that's great. Then the ApoE4s, he's treating everyone E4 or E3 largely the same because he's going for the same good markers.
But he's stricter with the
Except that
fours,
except that for 4s, he will say, for 3s or 2s, he'll say, go out and eat the animal fat,
That's what I was going to get to. So
No.
the E3, E4s are the real special thing with Gundry is a different strategy for the 4s.
Exactly.
And it involves
specifically for
primarily-
fat.
Specifically for the animal.
Saturated fat, yeah.
Does he think of, I have to ask him this, when you eat these animal fats, you're also eating animal proteins. I mean, the two go
Correct,
hand in
and that
hand.
is he also has low.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Protein,
is he
correct.
really happy it's the saturated fat from animal sources?
No, no,
or
no.
it's really the
Methionine.
carry-in protein?
He's 2 different things. I mean,
Okay.
he's looking at, so from a protein, for animal proteins standpoint, which is population-wide from his perspective, okay, keeping that low, as you are aging, is an IGF-1 mTOR issue. So he's in, the Ron Rosedale category that way.
For Longo
And so he's looking at keeping that low. And I asked him about, all right, so you're going to be, so the studies that say elderly people do better with more protein. I asked him that question specifically. And his perspective is that their guts are screwed up from a lifetime of poor eating, and therefore they don't absorb it well. If they get their guts in line, then they don't need as much.
What are your guys? Do you know? What do you feel about saturated fat, for instance? If you're talking about SAT in heart disease, so what would your approach be? Because we know what Gundry says.
Yeah.
So what would your approach be?
Yeah.
I guess, well, Gundry has, in his mind, he has his data and he's seen the markers
And
improve.
what do you feel?
Yeah, well, I don't have the data to support that bar Gundry's primarily
Right.
from the research that's out there, particularly on E3s, E4s. So I probably analysed around 1,000 or more scientific papers in the last 3 or 4 years, but actually going to find E3, E4 at sensitivity to saturated fat and what it does,
Not there.
you're down to Gundry. I mean, we have almost. It's very hard to find scientific analysis. Now, maybe you have some, and I haven't got, and certainly not 4/4s. I haven't looked hardly at all, homozygous, but E3, E4s. Now, I was really interested recently in a paper, and I think we shared this or discussed it, where in the book, for instance, we're doing E4 in general is around, in one huge study, is a 1.06 hazard ratio for heart disease, which is really nothing.
Right.
It's a big UK study.
Sure, right.
1.36 in another huge one. So I'm saying, okay, a 1.2x on average for E4 for heart disease. That's really small in my mind.
Sure, right,
I mean, that's
right.
really, really small. But then the companion paper was a study of hypertensive, all genotypes. And they found that, this was extraordinary actually, I was shocked at the ratios. They found that E4s in general had slightly more issues, but if they had metabolic syndrome markers, they were 4x.
Yeah.
And if they had
We
no
saw that
metabolic
paper.
syndrome markers, they had kind of 0.25.
That was a
Right.
paper.
We
There was
saw
a paper like
Yeah.
you
that
covered.
paper.
Now, it's
yeah.
a small bit of data, but it resonates hugely.
It
But
makes
I was
sense.
shocked at the sheer effect size. In other words, it's not just that insulin resistance syndrome mediates the E4 excess risk to a point.
Right.
It's like, I've never seen ratios that big.
Right.
If you expanded that and found out it was true, the whole game with E4 then is what you
Insulin
described
resistance.
earlier.
Yeah, so-
and everything associated with dysregulated signaling of information.
Just to continue, it's that,
Sorry.
we agree that you're doing great, Ivor. The clinical perspective, but we're addressing the inflammatory component. Look, that's what Gundry's doing as well. But when it comes to the saturated fat issue, it depends on the degree of insulin resistance, what's going on metabolically. We think that long term, once you've been keto adapted or you're on a particular program, that you end up eating less fat. You really are. And so now the protein issue, maybe a little more, a little bit less. And so I wonder, well, if you're an ApoE4/4, is there some inherent inflammatory predisposition?
We know there is.
There is.
There
There is.
know there
What's
is.
the mechanism?
Yeah.
Is it insulin resistance? Is there something
No,
beyond?
no,
There
it's
is.
the actual
Yeah, the
ahead.
mitochondria, right.
molecule. It's more the actual ApoE4 molecule has many cellular
Yes.
effects, and
Right.
because it's a different shape, it has aberrant. You remember he said it like switches on thousands of
Yeah,
different
it's got
genes.
1,700, promoter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Promoter
Yeah,
genes,
it's-
and
that
it's
is
and
gonna
it's and it's
influence.
basically aberrant cellular signaling and actually DNA promotion. It's an aberrant DNA promotion gene.
Under certain environmental conditions, you have aberrant
No,
problems.
all the time. No, all the time.
But this is the ancestral evolutionary gene.
And we
Why
will-
is it
and
defective
because-
inherently?
It's not necessarily
Bredesen
defective
says that we will-
because
yeah.
Aberrant.
because in an acute sense, inflammation is good.
You're walking on the you get a little stick in your foot. You can
Right,
you
when we
can
came down to the
eating
trees.
carrion.
Yeah.
So it was a survival gene.
True.
Right.
So what environment makes it aberrant chronically?
Absolutely.
Yeah, modern.
Exactly. So E4 then is not inherently problematic. It's
Right.
only problematic
In our
the
modern
context of
environment,
our
yeah.
environment.
It's the
And then you're
classic
straight down to
mismatch.
back to the original question. So what are the things
What's
that
the threshold?
awakens this sensitivity?
Right.
Right.
And saturated fat, so it sounds like Gundry isn't really sure of the saturated fat versus the animal protein. It might be a bit confounded. It's the animal products.
No, when he's looking at small dense LDL, he's looking at animal saturated fat.
But how is he getting the animal saturated fat with no protein involved? Because the two are usually together. He talks about cheese.
Well, you could,
Saturated fat.
you could
Only
eat
ate
cream,
two,
cheese,
but
whatever.
yeah.
But the protein is looking at the aging.
Oh, I know, but when the foods, if you put aside the protein and the Walter Longo and Rosedale and all that riff, Gundry perceives that certain foods exacerbate small dense LDL and
Right.
all that stuff. Those foods he sees are animal source foods, often in E4.
Well,
Animal
saturated
source-
fats.
Yeah, but let's tease that out without getting into the protein and cancer mTOR, IGF-1.
Right.
He perceives that certain animal products, foods, cause the problem. Within that, he's saying, I'm happy that even if there's no animal protein, the saturated fat is uniquely causing it. So I guess he has correlated people's intake of saturated animal fat, sans protein, with the small dense LDL. Is he happy he's done that? Or is the protein always on as a ride-along?
Well,
with
the protein
foods?
he applies to everybody.
Oh, true, but when he's convinced it's saturated fat element of the animal products, he's happy he's isolated the animal protein away, and it is definitely the saturated.
And
That's
one of
hard
the
to
things that he
grasp
tells
as a
us
way
is
of
that what he's
engineer.
observed actually is the worst offender from what he sees spiking SDLDL in 4s is cheese.
Yeah, which protein and saturated fat. Yeah, I wonder, it was my big question for Gundry, is he happy he's isolated pure animal fat
I
away
don't-
from
well,
the protein?
I don't know how.
Well, you're a supporter, so you'd say yes, but
Whether he's happy, I have no
Well, he
idea.
might
But-
acknowledge
Yeah, that's the whole
himself. I think, did Amber Ahern ask him this question in AHS, or a similar question?
She tried, yeah.
She tried,
He
but
didn't get it.
he dodged.
No, I think,
He does.
and it's not a criticism of Gundry. He might admit, well, look, now that you put it that way, largely it's the animal products, which I guess inherently is confounded with the protein. I haven't fully isolated, because I'd love to know, is it the fat? That's what I struggle with so much.
But coconut oil, the whole thing about we shouldn't have so much coconut
Yeah,
oil.
that was all just,
Well, but he's actually observed that at least in some 4s, that coconut oil,
oh, okay, good. So that might be his isolation of fat alone.
it is not, and he evolves over time watching his data, right?
True, so.
And so he's saying, and as he's gotten, as I've actually known him, as consulted with him, he has gotten stricter in terms of not having 4s eat coconut oil. And he also says it's individual, and he thinks that MCTs are probably okay, and he's not 100% sure, but he thinks they're probably okay for 4s.
So seeing that data would be the key, because it sounds like he has isolated saturated. It sounds like, I don't know,
But from a
like you
clinical,
say.
from a clinical
data.
perspective, we actually tell people to eat monounsaturated fat and saturated fat to reduce SDLDL. So it's kind of
Conflict
count
here.
as a little bit
So
of a
what
count.
are you doing with your patients? What fats are you telling them to eat?
So a variety of natural fats. So, but we do tell patients that are concerned that they have a high particle count that they can switch to monounsaturated fat. So, and we'll see particle count come down, and we'll see particle quality go up. So it depends on the patient and just how comfortable they are or not with, a rising particle count. And we like to look at imaging because that'll definitely give us a lot of information. Now, it is available in New Zealand.
Yeah,
the calcium.
$380. I had it there. Yep.
Yeah, well, right. We've talked about some patients. We've shared
Yeah.
data back and forth about calcium scans. So, that can ultimately tell us about disease process.
Very
where
helpful.
It's a marker of disease.
Sure.
Okay. And so the other issue is that all these blood markers are really surrogate markers
Right.
to atherosclerosis.
Mm-hmm.
So clinically, that really is helpful to us.
But it sounds like Gundry, in fairness, is triangulating a whole series of good markers, which is great, as opposed to...
And he has, and I'm not familiar with it, but he has another test, which is a much more expensive blood test, which he looks at for people that he thinks really have a problem. And I'd have to look it up and see what it is.
Oh, expensive. Not PLA2 and all those kinds of things, or...
No. This is special. It's not in his panel. It's
This panel special already.
I know.
Unbelievable.
But
this is really special. I mean, it's like probably an $800 or $900 test just by itself.
Okay.
And it's a blood test
For what?
Wow.
for looking at heart disease.
Not
In specific, it isn't across the.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Is it the chorus?
I believe it maybe is.
What's
Okay,
that?
yeah.
Andrea?
I can't get it. It's a whole lot of markers. They're all surrogate markers. They're supposed to correlate well with established cardiovascular disease.
CORD.
US is
It's an
very
acronym.
expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Come across an article somewhere on it.
Yeah.
But he does that selectively,
Very
very
powerful
selectively. If he thinks he's got somebody with a problem,
Yeah.
he will run that on them.
Okay.
And in fact, in that study that I mentioned, he said that one of the guys that had the bypass, it was predicted by a rising core score.
It
And so,
correlates really well with actual incidents.
right.
So, yeah.
That's like
And
their
I think
measures
it's a
of
part
actual.
of it, but there's a DNA component to
No, I
correlate,
Steve,
if
I
I'm not wrong.
meant
Yeah.
analogous to troponin as opposed to cholesterol or a
Sure.
forward-looking longitudinal. It's more a, hey, it's going on now.
Yes.
The type of measure.
Yeah.
And there is a difference, whereas the
Right.
other things are, okay, you're high in this, that means it's leading towards high risk because
Right.
of this state. Yeah, okay.
Can I ask Ivor a totally different question? I've been wanting to ask
learning.
this for
Yeah, we're learning.
a long time. Ivor, so you come from a country where there's public health as well, and not access, like me, and not access to millions of very expensive tests. Do you think that all these expensive tests add any value?
Well, I can't speak on the ones I'm not really familiar with. But when we say expensive, the advanced lipoprotein panel is expensive compared to the
Yeah,
traditional.
well, we can't get it all, for instance. Do you think it
Yeah.
adds any value if you can, or is it mainly in the insulin resistance?
Possibly in specific cases, unusual cases, but for the broad population, if you've got a standard lipid panel and a standard liver panel with GGT, and you've got serum ferritin, and you've got your insulin, glucose for HOMA, and you put that with your ratios from the standard lipid panel. We were just talking about this last night with a young doctor from Ireland, and add in a couple more maybe. That gating process, if you have all of those and you can professionally triangulate them and look for risk, I think that's going to catch most people. I'll give an example. My sponsor was tested. He's very wealthy and he's promoting now calcification scan and all that stuff. He had executive medicals every year for 8 years, top of the range testing, and they never found out he had massive heart disease, and they never found out he was ragingly diabetic. But they could have easily. One postprandial glucose would have seen after a standard meal he was going up to nearly 300.
Oh,
But they never did a postprandial. That's an easy test. And they never did an insulin. They would have seen he was diabetic because you don't do insulins. So So there's postprandial glucose and insulin are really cheap and easy, and they would catch untold numbers of people heading for heart attacks. But they don't even use them. But they'll use the advanced lipoprotein panel, the LDLP.
I feel left out that you didn't ask the American doctor the same question.
Also the American
Oh,
doctor.
it was
American
the, it was the public
You would have
health.
I know.
She was saving best for last.
I know
There
it's
you
the
are.
public health thing.
Yeah.
So we have a good doctor friend, Steve Horvitz from New Jersey, and he's a nutrition-focused guy. We were having this discussion the other day that the longer and longer that we've been in clinical practice, and I'm going on almost 30 years, is that we are getting a lot of useful information by just doing less testing.
Yeah.
Wow.
And just simplifying things.
Yeah.
And you know, what Ivor's referring to, just a 2-hour glucose or a 2-hour insulin, that's a very simple test. And-
What
and-
tape measure around the waist?
There you go.
Just,
Ultimately.
just
Yeah.
measure body measurements and you have all the information, as opposed to, you know, Dr. Gundry's approach, and it's fascinating to look at all the metrics. And I don't know what the cost is, but George has said it's, yeah. And so maybe we're simplifying it too much by doing simple tests, but, you know, in my clinical experience, we get a lot of information with simple tests.
The phrase.
In Europe, what would you call it?
Oh, I've no idea yet, because that'll be a year away, and I'm just up to here with work. I put anything that can be put off.
But we have a bit of ApoE in there. We have a little bit of ApoE.
We have covered ApoE, yes, and familial hypercholesterolemia, and even named Gundry and recommended his protocol for people who are concerned. We're not saying we fully agree with it, but equally, this appears to have success. So all of that is in there, and we give a guideline on the dietary changes. If you do go up high in cholesterol, or if your markers do go deleteriously the wrong way, this is an option for you. And we kind of mentioned backing off the animal protein and products, and bringing in the monos and the. So even though I'm arguing against it now for purposes of argument, we have to take on board that it appears there's evidence to support it and give it to people as an option. Personally, I'm not sure I'd do it. What about the animal products and overeating? So has Gundry separated out the people who are genuinely keto adapted, fat adapted, and after a period of time do quite a bit of intermittent fasting and eating relatively not so much fat, as a percentage maybe it's high? Or is he also including people who are really noshing in and indulging in?
Well, he is trying to get people to not do that.
He's trying, but I wonder, would he feel that the people with the markers going the wrong way maybe are biased towards the people who are really enjoying the food and eating lots?
I don't know.
I wonder, does he have people who are actually eating the way you ought to, as an E4, an ancestral person? Intermittent fasting, meal skipping, staying lean, and then he also perceives they can have a problem in that regime with animal products, or is it more the people who are gluttoning a little? I'd love to know that too.
You know, and this is back to Andrea's question on the testing and everything. You know, one thing we had, we were talking with Dr. Terry Walls a year ago at Ancestral
She
Health.
hardly tests
And she
anything.
hardly tests.
Yeah.
She tests like
She
5
tests
things.
less than I do.
Because she's
And-
financially constrained?
Yeah, she's in the VA.
And
She's,
she gets
reality.
great
Yeah,
results.
she's- and
She gets
the
fantastic
Veterans Administration,
results.
you know, she's in there. They don't have
Yeah.
a lot of resources, and Gundry is doing this because he looks at himself as being a researcher, right? And so he looks at his raft of tests as a researcher. Not that that's the model for every clinician. I mean, he doesn't look at it as that's the model for every clinician. And in fact, he just says there's a lot, and he talks about people that just have taken his sheet of eat, don't eat, and followed that, and that's all they need. You know, it's not like, you know, you had to do all these tests. It's just like,
Well, you know, the learnings he gets, hopefully he can translate them into low-cost, simpler tests. Maybe he's doing that. I mean, when he sees the markers go into a bad place, the exotic markers, is he all the time trying to correlate that with the more basic markers and see is there a proxy there?
you know, I don't know that he's trying to
Or
do that,
not.
but I think he's just saying, if you just take my list, take my book, take whatever,
work.
and just do it, you know, you've solved, you know, you've taken a huge cut at the whole thing, you know, and not that you have to go through all this.
Yeah, and maybe then you can just go with the standard tests to indicate if you're insulin sensitive or not, and trick over HDL and basic ones.
Right.
Yeah, that's reasonable. wonder though, would his stuff show up in more standard tests? I'd just be really curious. Does he really need the advanced ones to see these things?
Well,
And
just
how real are they?
standard lipid testing, I kind of look at it, Gundry's approach is almost the best of everything when you put these diet options together. And I explain it to patients, and you can see ratios and
Other things improving too.
You can see simple things improve
Improving
just
too,
by.
And at this point, half of his patient load are people with autoimmune issues.
Yeah, they're motivated. They go to see him
And
motivated.
he himself is what he calls a canary, which means he reacts to all that stuff. And he has other patients. He talks in his book. He talks about a gal who had severe migraines, and he got her off the lectins, and her migraines went away. And then he had her actually, because I've forgotten, I think she was canning something. She grew things and canned them in a relish, and she wanted to. That was her life's passion, right?
Yeah.
And so he said, okay, do a test and do one of them the way you did it before, and I want you to pressure cook it and do it.
I heard this interview.
And then the pressure cooked worked and the other didn't. But then she was very sensitive and she was cooperative, and so she would try, how do I deactivate lectins in a variety of things, and what can I do and what works and what doesn't? And so he's actually, now, is that a laboratory? But he's using this patient as a tester to test this stuff out.
And some people would criticize the n=1, but to be
Right.
honest, add up a lot of n=1s, and
Yep.
it's very valid.
Yep.
But the pharmaceutical kind of complex would say if it's not RCT, it's
Right.
blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But I saw an interview and he discussed that, and he discussed the casein types.
Right,
And
the
it's
A1,
not
A2.
really lactose, it's
Right.
casein. So that recent interview with him, based on his book, he talks about the kidney beans and the lectins and
Right.
the pressure cooker.
Right.
That was all great. Did you see that? That was a great interview, I thought.
Right.
He really, yeah. So I'd agree with all of that broad stuff around those problematic plants.
I mean, and he also says that a lot of it comes from the gut, and that
Yeah.
especially in America, we have screwed up our food supplies so badly, and with all the antibiotics
Exposed.
and everything, and the Roundup and all that it messes you up. And Andrea and I have talked about this. He says, okay, I send patients, and Andrea says she experienced this in Cuba. I send patients to go to France. They go to Italy, and they eat white bread. Doesn't have the wheat germ, and they eat white bread, and it's raised with either sourdough or yeast, and they do fine.
Without the preservatives.
And they come back here, and
Worse.
they're
Without-
toast,
without the Roundup.
And so it's not like it's everywhere.
And I like the fact that recent papers, Gudmundur from Iceland sent them on. Maybe it changed a little bit, but the microbiome is the big fad at the moment.
Right.
And there's not a huge amount of hard science showing us what it drives and what it doesn't drive. But there's some really nice recent papers, because I believe the insulin dysregulation, when it's not a cause of problems, it's an excellent metric to reflect underlying problems. But a couple of recent papers showed where they actually introduced to humans LPS lipopolysaccharide, which
Right.
you get through leaky gut and microbiome,
Right.
introduced it and showed clearly a rise in insulin resistance in the
Wow.
following 24 hours.
Wow.
And there's a few of those experiments, they're rare, but Gudmundur has dug them out. And I love that because it shows a direct cause effect of microbiome effects on insulin sensitivity
Wow.
in humans. But there's very few of those. A lot of them are just mechanism.
Right.
Mice.
There was
Yeah,
a
he has
dude
mice,
at
similar thing.
Ancestral Health who was
Amazing.
doing research in it. Ancestral Health last year, there was a guy who's doing
Maybe.
Great.
research but not in humans.
It's great to see that cause and effect demonstrated, at least in principle. It's not just theoretical. But yeah, it's an interesting field. But then I wonder, to fix your microbiome, what's the root of the root? How do you fix, if your microbiome is a root cause in the chain of cause to bad health, metabolic dysregulation, and it seems to be, what's the real root that causes the microbiome to be bad, or you can change to make the microbiome better? That's kind of what I'm interested to, and I believe a lot of that is through your mouth, of course.
Is there real proof that there's a problem with the microbiome?
Well, these experiments were the rare ones that tend to show direct causal between microbiome and problems, because they basically essentially make a bad microbiome, inject lipopolysaccharide, and show your immune reaction.
So they get the poops, basically. Is that what happens? Is that
I can't remember the exact details. They introduced lipopolysaccharide that would occur with poor microbiome and leaky gut, and they actually introduced it to the human, and they show the immune response jumping up, and they show the insulin sensitivity falling. It's causal. But the real question then is, okay, the microbiome is causal in and of itself. It's a link in the chain. How do you make your microbiome good? That's the real root cause.
I think that the immune system is related to, I mean, if your immune system is shot, then you're going to have a lot of weird stuff happening in your intestines.
So the people in this experiment, I think they were healthy people as opposed to people who were shot. They just introduced a single intervention, the lipopolysaccharide, into the human system.
And some of the data suggests that the microbiome is communicating with the immune system.
Tons of that as well.
Through the vagus nerve.
I think it's really
lots of
fascinating.
data.
Yeah. But the problem is, I couldn't put my hand on my heart and say, bar experiments like that, the direct cause of microbiome to metabolic dysfunction. And still the question for me is, if your microbiome is bad, what are the primary things you fix to fix it? Is it like pills and transplants? Or is it just getting your diet right so that naturally resolves? What do you reckon on the microbiome?
Yeah, well, I couldn't say it better than you, Ivor. That was beautiful, to be honest.
I think there have been some studies showing that probiotics have a very short life in the system.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
They're helpful as Band-Aids.
Band-Aids.
Right, they're lovely
Not
Band-Aids.
systemic long-term
No.
system
That's gonna be-
changes.
No, that's right.
And dirt, we need dirt, we need to roll in dirt.
Right.
Especially ApoE4
And parasites.
Probably,
We
yeah.
need to drink worms and,
Parasites.
right, that's.
Tequila, I believe, as well.
I know.
I think it's dead. We need a live one.
Well, our physician assistant is our gut expert, Erin Kay.
Oh, Erin, yes.
Yeah, and George knows her, and so we do try to address this, that if there's autoimmune problems, we look at the gut, and without getting into what is the mechanism, we try to improve symptoms, and come at it from all directions.
Clearly, like fecal transplants work in some cases very well, and dramatically, and they can stay. But then the question is, because there have been some other things about, like, well, it depends on who you get your fecal transplant from, and you can end up with some of their characteristics, and it's not just you're fixing your gut, but you may end up with, like, for example, I think there have been some things where somebody gets a fecal transplant from an obese person, they get
There were mice studies.
Yeah.
There were mice studies, lots of studies like that. You can switch mice, I don't know, make them fat and thin.
Right.
Was there a
by-
reproducibility problem with some of those mice studies? I didn't go in deep, that some of them, when replicated, didn't have the expected effect.
Oh.
I think
That's
there's quite a
interesting.
few of them, but I've heard that from someone who, I can't remember who it was, but very reputable, very smart person. And I remember thinking, that's interesting, because I never dug deep enough into those to find that. This person did. I think it might have been good wonder on himself, I'm not sure. But either way, it's a rich area, yeah. I don't know a whole lot about it. Yeah, in fairness.
This is a little the subject, but somebody who has normal markers that has extraordinarily high triglycerides, like almost near 300, but their other markers are okay. What mechanism could do something
I've heard
like
that a few times,
So-
and it's a tricky one.
But clinically, we see people that have changed their diet, they've cleaned up their diet, and we'll see the triglycerides. It's a familial pattern, no doubt, but they
And this
come
is
in.
true in this family, there are other people with high.
Yeah, and so they would come in, their triglycerides could be 900, 1,000 different units, but and then we change their diet, it comes down to 300, and that's it. And they have a persistent low HDL.
Yes.
The HDL doesn't come up; it comes up a tiny bit. So there's something familial going on, and all the other markers look excellent, as you say.
Yeah, the lady wrote,
No.
and her insulin was 2.
Is